good evening. Find a comfortable position and let the room go quiet. If you are winding down for the night, this is a good place to be. Somewhere warm, somewhere safe. Because tonight we are going somewhere. We are going to London, to the year 1870, to a room shaped like a small theatre, with wooden benches rising in tiers around a table in the center. There is sawdust on the floor. There is a smell in the air that does not belong in any room where healing is supposed to happen. And on that table, in a few minutes, a man is going to lose his leg. He will not feel it happen. That much has changed. A few years earlier, he would have been held down by 4 strong men while he screamed. And a surgeon would have been judged by how fast he could finish before the pain became unbearable. Now there is a rag soaked in something sweet-smelling. The world goes dark, and when it comes back, the leg is simply gone. That sounds like progress. In some ways it was. But stay with me tonight, because the story of this room is stranger and darker than a simple tale of medical advancement. The same year that a man could sleep through the loss of a limb, roughly half of the patients who underwent a major amputation in some hospitals would be dead within weeks. Not from the surgery, from something the surgeon carried into the room on his own hands and never once thought to wash off. Get settled. Dim the lights if you can. Tonight we go inside the operating theatre. Tonight we're going to follow a surgeon, his patients, through a single day at a London teaching hospital in the year 1870. At the exact hinge point of medical history, when pain had finally been conquered, but infection. The version of this story that most people carry in their heads is a simple one. Anesthesia was invented, surgery became survivable, and medicine marched steadily forward into the modern age we know today. That version leaves out the part that actually matters. The truth is that 1870 sits in one of the strangest and most dangerous gaps in the history of medicine. Ether and chloroform had already made it possible to keep a patient asleep and pain-free through an operation that would once have been unthinkable. Surgeons could now open a body, work slowly, work carefully, take the time that precision requires, because the patient was no longer thrashing beneath them. That should have made surgery safer. In many ways, for a few crucial years, it made things worse. Because the moment surgeons stopped needing to race against a screaming, struggling patient, they started operating on people who would never have survived the older, faster, cruder methods. More operations were attempted. More wounds were opened. And into every one of those wounds, completely unknowingly, the surgeons carried something they could not see, could not smell, and did not believe existed. By the time we finish tonight, you will understand exactly what killed most of the people who died in a Victorian operating theatre, and it was almost never the operation itself. Before we go any further, if this kind of evening suits you, if you like settling in with history that feels like a place you can visit rather than a list of dates to memorize, would you take a moment to subscribe? It costs nothing, but it helps more than you might think. And it means we can keep making these. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you are tonight and what time it is where you are. I always read them. Wherever you are, I am glad you are here. Now, we go to London. We go to 1870. The gas lamps are being lit along the streets outside the hospital, and inside, in a room built like a small amphitheatre, the benches are already filling with young men who have come to watch. It is a Tuesday morning in November, and the fog has settled over the city the way it does most mornings this time of year, thick and yellow-brown, carrying the smell of coal smoke and the Thames and something else underneath, something organic and faintly sweet that clings to the back of the throat. London in 1870 is the largest city on earth, home to over 3 million people, and it is a city that has grown faster than its infrastructure, its sanitation, or its medical knowledge can keep pace with. The streets near the hospital are narrow and crowded, lined with brick buildings, blackened by decades of soot, and the traffic moves in a constant, grinding current of hansom cabs, delivery carts, and pedestrians who step carefully around the puddles that are not entirely water. The hospital itself is one of the great teaching institutions of the city, a sprawling complex of wards and lecture halls that has trained surgeons for generations. It admits the poor, the injured, the desperate, people who have nowhere else to go and no money to pay for care in their own homes, which is still, in 1870, considered the more respectable way to be treated if you can afford it. The wealthy are operated on in their own bedrooms, on kitchen tables, surrounded by their own furniture and their own family, with the surgeon traveling to them. The hospital is for everyone else. The factory worker who caught his arm in a machine, the dock laborer whose leg was crushed beneath a falling crate, the child who fell from a tenement stairwell. They come here because it is free, and because the alternative to treatment is simply to die of the injury untreated. The hospital does not smell the way you might expect a place of healing to smell. There is coal smoke from 100 fireplaces, because central heating does not exist, and every ward depends on its own hearth. There is the sharp chemical bite of the few disinfectants that are used, mostly to mask odors rather than kill anything. There is the smell of unwashed bodies, because bathing facilities are limited, and many patients arrive in the same clothes they were injured in, sometimes days earlier. And beneath all of it, in the surgical wards especially, there is a smell that the staff have learned to live with, and even, in a strange way, to take a grim pride in. A smell of decay, of wounds that are not healing the way they should. The surgeons and nurses have a name for it, spoken almost affectionately, the way soldiers might speak of the mud of a familiar battlefield. They call it the good old hospital stink. At the heart of the surgical wing is the operating theatre, and the word theatre is not a metaphor. It was built, quite literally, as a theatre. A steeply raked gallery of wooden benches rises in a horseshoe around a central table, designed so that as many as 150 medical students can look down on the surgeon's hands from every angle. The room has a skylight above because gas lighting is unreliable and the surgeon needs to see clearly, and on a bright day, the light falls in a column onto the table below, illuminating the patient like the subject of a painting. The floor is bare wood, occasionally covered with sawdust to soak up what is coming. There is no running water in the room. There is a single basin, used and reused, the water in it changing color as the morning's operations proceed. The theatre's origins reach back to a very different tradition, one worth understanding because it explains why a room designed for healing came to look so much like a room designed for spectacle. Anatomical demonstrations, in which the bodies of executed criminals were publicly dissected before crowds of students and curious onlookers, had been a fixture of European medical education since the Renaissance, and the architecture of those anatomical theatres, tiered seating rising around a central stage, was carried forward, largely unchanged, into the surgical theatres of the 19th century. The design was practical, in the sense that it allowed the greatest possible number of students to observe a procedure at once, but it also carried forward something less practical and more troubling, an inherited culture in which the body on the table was, in some persistent and uncomfortable sense, also a performance for the benefit of the audience above. The benches themselves fill quickly on a morning when a well-known surgeon is operating, and the atmosphere in the gallery before a procedure begins bears a closer resemblance to a lecture hall before a popular speaker than to anything a modern visitor would recognize as appropriate to a hospital. Students arrive early to claim the best seats close to the table, where the details of the surgeon's technique can be observed most clearly. There is conversation. There is, on cold mornings, a certain amount of stamping of feet and rubbing of hands to stay warm, since the theatre itself is heated only by whatever warmth rises from the wards below, and a single fireplace that does little against the chill of a room with a skylight open to the London winter. Some of the older or more established students smoke, a habit tolerated by the hospital's administration with a casualness that a modern visitor would find difficult to comprehend, the smoke drifting upward through the shaft of light beneath the skylight and mixing by the middle of a busy morning with smells that no gentleman would associate with tobacco under any other circumstances. Beyond the theatre and the wards, the hospital complex includes a dispensary where medicines are prepared and distributed, a small chapel used for services and for the private grief of families whose loved ones have not survived, and a mortuary tucked away in a lower level of the building. Its existence acknowledged by the staff in the same matter-of-fact tone they might use to discuss the laundry or the kitchens. Death is not hidden in this hospital the way it will come to be hidden in later generations of medical institutions. It is simply a regular, expected outcome of the work being done here, woven into the daily rhythm of the wards, in a way that shapes the entire emotional register of everyone who works within these walls, staff and students alike. This is where our story unfolds today. Not in the drawing rooms of the wealthy, not in the laboratories of the scientists who are, even now, beginning to suspect the truth that will eventually save millions of lives, but here, in this theatre, where anatomical skill has reached a level of genuine brilliance and microscopic understanding remains almost entirely absent. Where a surgeon can remove a leg in under a minute with technical precision that would impress a modern observer, and then, without washing his hands, without cleaning his instruments, without any awareness that he is doing so, plant the seeds of the infection that will very likely kill the patient he has just saved from bleeding to death. Let us go and find the man who will walk us through this day. His name is William Hartley, and he is 22 years old. He is not the surgeon. He is something both more humble and, in a strange way, more essential to the daily function of the hospital. He is a dresser, which is the term used at this time for a senior medical student who has moved beyond lectures and into the hands-on apprenticeship that forms the core of Victorian surgical training. William has been at the hospital for 3 years now. He has attended lectures on anatomy, on physiology, on the theory of surgery, and he has spent countless hours in this operating theatre, first as one of the anonymous faces in the gallery, and now, in his final year of training, as one of the small number of students permitted to stand at the table itself, close enough to hand the surgeon his instruments, close enough to hold a limb steady, close enough to see in exhausting and intimate detail exactly what happens to a human body under the knife. William comes from a family of modest means in Yorkshire. His father is a solicitor in a market town, respectable but not wealthy, and the cost of William's medical training has stretched the family's resources considerably. This matters to William in a way that shapes his entire relationship to his work. He is not here out of idle curiosity or family tradition, the way some of his fellow students are, young men whose fathers are already established physicians and who drift through their training with the confidence that comes from knowing a comfortable practice. William has something to prove and something to lose. If he fails to qualify, if he cannot secure a position, the investment his family has made will have been wasted. And he understands this with the clarity of a young man who has watched his parents count coins carefully at the kitchen table. He has a younger sister, Margaret, still at home in Yorkshire, and she writes to him roughly once a month in a careful, looping hand, filling her letters with small news of the town, the health of their mother, the progress of a courtship she is conducting with the son of a local wool merchant, a young man William has met only twice but has decided, on the strength of those two brief encounters, that he approves of. William keeps her letters in the same drawer where he keeps his notebook, and he answers them dutifully, though his own letters home tend toward the practical rather than the confessional. He does not write to his family about the things he sees in the wards. He does not describe the smell or the sound of the saw or the exact expression on a mother's face when she understands that her child is not going to recover. He writes about his studies, his examinations, the ordinary texture of a student's life, because he has decided, without ever quite articulating the decision to himself, that some of what happens inside this hospital does not belong in a letter meant to reassure a family who has already sacrificed so much to send him here. This selective silence is not unique to William. It is one of the quiet, unspoken adaptations that every medical student at this hospital eventually makes, a kind of emotional accounting in which certain experiences are set aside, compartmentalized, held apart from the rest of one's life, rather than processed and released. William has watched this happen to his fellow students over the 3 years of his training, watched young men who arrived nervous and visibly affected by their first amputations gradually develop the calm, steady affect that the profession demands, and he has wondered more than once whether the calm is a form of genuine strength or simply a more sophisticated kind of avoidance. He suspects, on his more honest evenings, that it is both, and that the distinction may not matter very much to a young man who still has 2 more years of training ahead of him and cannot afford the luxury of being undone by what he witnesses. There is a particular ritual William has developed for himself over these 3 years, small and entirely private, that helps him carry the weight of what he sees without either shutting it out completely or letting it overwhelm him. Each night, before he blows out his candle, he allows himself exactly one memory from the day to surface fully. One patient, one moment, one small human detail he permits himself to feel without immediately retreating into the clinical detachment his training rewards. Tonight, it will be Perrin's story about his son limping in imitation of his father, told with such plain, unguarded affection that William found himself smiling in a ward that gave him little other reason to. Tomorrow, it may be someone else entirely. This is not a technique William learned from any lecturer or textbook. It is something he arrived at on his own in his 2nd year of training, after a week in which he tried to feel everything at once and found himself unable to function, and it has served him well enough since that. He has never told anyone about it, not even the 2 students who share his lodgings and know most of the other details of his daily life. He lodges in a rented room a short walk from the hospital, sharing the building with 2 other students, and his days follow a punishing rhythm that leaves little room for anything beyond medicine. He rises before dawn. He attends the wards, checks on patients from the previous day's operations, changes dressings, which is the origin of his title, and observes the surgeon's morning rounds. He attends lectures. He assists in the operating theatre whenever his rotation requires it, and in the evenings, when his body is exhausted and his mind should by rights be equally spent, he studies by candlelight, working through anatomical texts and surgical manuals, because the examinations that will determine his future are approaching, and he cannot afford to be anything less than thoroughly prepared. There is one detail about William that his fellow students find slightly odd, though not unkind. He keeps a small notebook, separate from his official case notes, in which he records not just the surgical details of the operations he witnesses, but small, human observations about the patients themselves. Their names, when he can learn them. A detail about their family, if they mention one. The distinct way a person's face changes in the moment before the chloroform takes effect. That brief transition from fear to blankness that William has watched perhaps 200 times now and still finds himself unable to look away from. His fellow students tease him gently for this habit, calling him sentimental, telling him that a surgeon cannot afford to think of patients as anything other than cases, that the profession requires a certain necessary distance. William nods when they say this, and continues keeping his notebook anyway. Today is an important day for William, and not merely because of the volume of surgery scheduled. Today, for the first time, he has been asked to assist directly in a major amputation, standing at the surgeon's elbow rather than watching from the gallery. The surgeon he will be assisting is a man named Mr. Edmund Croft, one of the senior surgeons of the hospital, a figure of considerable reputation among the students, admired for his speed, his confidence, and the sheer theatrical command he brings to every operation. Mr. Croft has performed thousands of operations over a career spanning more than 2 decades. He is, by any measure that Victorian medicine recognizes, one of the finest surgeons in London. He is also, though neither he nor William would ever think to describe him this way, one of the most dangerous men in the building. William does not know this yet, not consciously. He has absorbed, the way every student absorbs the assumptions of his training, the belief that surgical skill is measured in speed and precision, that the surgeon's hands are instruments of healing, that the greatest danger to a patient lies in the wound itself and the surgeon's ability to close it before shock or blood loss claims the patient's life. He is being taught, implicitly and explicitly, that the stains on Mr. Croft's operating coat, dark brown and stiffened with the accumulated residue of hundreds of procedures, are a mark of experience rather than a source of danger. He has heard Mr. Croft say, more than once, with a note of genuine pride, that a surgeon's coat should never be washed, that the build-up of blood and matter is a badge of a working life spent at the table. Today, William will hand Mr. B. Wash Croft his instruments with his own bare hands, instruments that were used on yesterday's patients and have not been cleaned since. He will watch the operation proceed with a skill that will deeply impress him. And tonight, when it is over, he will write in his notebook, as he always does, a record of what he witnessed, entirely unaware that the greatest danger of the entire day has already occurred, visibly, in the seconds before the first incision was made. Let us follow him into the morning. William wakes at 5, well before the sun, in a room lit only by the guttering stub of the previous night's candle. The building is cold. Coal is expensive, and students do not keep their fires burning through the night. He dresses quickly, his breath visible in the dim light, pulling on the layers that will carry him through a 16-hour day. Woolen trousers. Over it all, his working coat, which is not the same as Mr. Croft's operating coat, but which has, in 3 years of hospital service, acquired its own history of stains that William has stopped noticing. He walks to the hospital through streets that are just beginning to stir. The lamplighters have already extinguished the gas lamps, since dawn is close enough now that they are no longer needed, and the first costermongers are setting up their carts at the corners, calling out the morning's prices. The fog has not lifted. It rarely does before midday in November. William walks with his collar turned up and his hands in his pockets, and by the time he reaches the hospital gates, his face is numb with cold. The wards are already active when he arrives. A hospital does not sleep. Not really. The night nurses are handing over their duties to the day staff, with the brisk, practiced efficiency of people who have done this every morning for years. William's first task is to check on the patients from yesterday's operations, and this is where the real education of a Victorian medical student happens, not in the dramatic theatre of the operating room, but in the long, quiet, unglamorous work of the wards. The surgical ward is a single long room lined with iron bedsteads, perhaps 30 of them, packed closely enough that there is barely room to walk between. This is standard practice. Hospital administrators, working within tight budgets and facing constant demand for beds, pack patients in as densely as the space allows. The ward has high ceilings and tall windows, which the Victorian medical establishment believes is important for the circulation of air, since the prevailing theory holds that disease is spread by miasma, by bad air itself, rather than by anything that might be transmitted through contact. The windows are opened at midday, weather permitting, in a ritual airing that the staff believe helps prevent the spread of infection. It does not. It cannot. The real danger in this ward has nothing to do with the air and everything to do with the hands that move from bed to bed. William begins his rounds. In the third bed lies a man named Thomas Perrine, a dock labourer, whose leg was amputated below the knee 6 days ago after a crushing injury. Perrine is 34 years old, married with 3 children, and William has grown fond of him over the course of his recovery, in the way that a caregiver grows attached to a patient who is polite, uncomplaining, and grateful for every small kindness. Perrine's wound needs redressing this morning, and William approaches the bed with a roll of bandages and the basin of water that constitute the entirety of his equipment. He unwraps the previous day's dressing carefully. The smell reaches him before the wound is fully exposed, a thick, sweetish odor that every dresser in the hospital learns to recognize within their first month of training. The wound itself is discharging a substance that is, to William's trained eye, entirely reassuring. Thick, creamy, a pale yellowish white flowing steadily from the incision site. This is laudable pus, and William has been taught by lecturers whose authority he has no reason to question that its presence is a sign of healthy healing. The theory inherited from medical thinking that stretches back to the ancient world holds that a wound must pass through a stage of suppuration as part of the natural process of repair. A wound that produces this thick, well-formed discharge is considered to be progressing correctly. A wound that remains dry, by contrast, or that produces a thin, watery discharge, is viewed with more concern, as though the body is somehow failing to perform the necessary work of healing. William cleans the wound with a cloth, the same basin of water he will use for the next patient, and applies a fresh dressing. He notes in his official casebook that Perrine's wound is discharging laudable pus, and that his recovery appears to be proceeding satisfactorily. He does not know, because no one in this building knows, that the substance he has just described with genuine clinical approval is in fact a visible sign that Perrine's body is losing a war against bacterial infection. He does not know that the cloth he used to clean the wound and the basin of water, both already used on other patients this morning, are actively transferring organisms from bed to bed with every round he makes. He believes he is providing careful, competent medical care. In a sense, that would horrify him if he understood it. He is functioning as a vector, moving invisible death from one vulnerable body to the next, with the same hands that sincerely wish to heal. The ward has patients in every stage of recovery, and every stage tells its own story to a modern eye, even though William reads none of it correctly. There is a woman named Sarah Higgins in the 8th bed, recovering from a mastectomy performed 4 days ago, whose wound looks clean and is healing without complication. though William has no way of knowing that the surgeon who operated on her happened, by chance rather than design, to have relatively clean hands that day. There is a boy named Edward, no older than 12, in the 14th bed, whose leg was amputated after a factory accident, and who is beginning to show the first signs of a fever that William notes with a small, private worry, but does not yet recognize as the opening movement of something that will likely kill him within the week. And there is a curtained-off section near the far end of the ward, separated from the other beds by a simple canvas partition, where 2 patients lie who are further along in an illness that the staff refer to in low voices as hospital gangrene. William has seen this before. Everyone who trains here has seen it before, because it is one of the great, terrible, recurring features of Victorian surgical wards, a flesh-destroying infection that can appear in a clean-looking wound and spread with a speed that seems almost supernatural to observers who have no concept of bacteria. Poorly ventilated tissue. The 2 patients behind the curtain are not expected to survive. William does not go near them this morning. There is nothing to be done, and the smell alone is enough to keep most of the staff at a careful distance, though of course the smell is not the danger. The danger passed from patient to patient long before it announced itself with an odor anyone could detect. One of the 2 patients behind that curtain is a woman named Ellen Grady, admitted 11 days ago for what should have been a straightforward and survivable procedure, the setting of a broken arm sustained in a fall. William dressed her wound himself on 3 separate occasions before the infection took hold, and he remembers her as talkative and good-humored despite her pain. A laundress with 4 children who spent much of her first week in the ward worrying aloud to anyone who would listen about who was managing the washing in her absence. She stopped talking 4 days ago. The senior sister who oversees the ward has told William, in the flat, practiced tone of a woman who has delivered this news many times before, that Ellen Grady will likely not see the week out. William has not told her family this directly, because it is not his place to do so, but he has seen the certain stillness on the ward sister's face that he has come to recognize as the professional mask worn over grief that cannot, in a working hospital, be allowed to interfere with the next task at hand. Nothing connects Ellen Grady's fate in the minds of anyone treating her to the hands that dressed her wound or the basin of water used to clean it. The same basin, the same cloth, moving from bed to bed across this ward every single morning. The infection that is killing her is understood by every doctor and nurse in this building as a mystery of the air, an unfortunate consequence of the ward's ventilation or the patient's own weakened constitution, rather than as the entirely preventable result of a chain of contact. And the willingness to use them between patients. By 7 o'clock, William has completed his rounds of the surgical ward. His hands, which have touched perhaps a dozen wounds in various stages of healing and infection, have not been washed since he arrived at the hospital 2 hours earlier. There is no expectation that they should be. Hand washing, in the medical understanding of 1870, is a matter of basic decency and comfort, not a matter of preventing the transmission of disease. A surgeon or a dresser washes his hands the way a gentleman washes his hands before dinner, because dirt is unpleasant, not because invisible organisms might be clinging to the skin and waiting for the next open wound. William has a brief window before the morning's lectures begin, and he uses it to eat a small breakfast in the students' common room, bread and butter and strong tea, standing near the fire because the room is cold and the walk from the ward has left him chilled. His fellow students are discussing the morning's scheduled surgery, and there is a current of genuine excitement in the conversation, because Mr. Croft is operating today, and Mr. Croft's operations are always something worth seeing. He did a leg in under a minute last month, one student says. A young man named Frederick, who has a talent for hero worship, and applies it liberally to any surgeon with a reputation for speed. Incision to closure. I timed it myself. Liston used to do it faster, says another student, invoking the name of a surgeon a generation gone now. A man whose legend still circulates through every medical school in London like a piece of scripture. Under 30 seconds, they say, though I suppose we'll never know for certain. William listens to this conversation with the mixture of admiration and unease that has been growing in him over the past several months, though he could not fully articulate its source, even if pressed. Croft's skill without reservation. He has watched the man work and has been astonished more than once by the sheer economy of motion, the certainty of every cut, the way an operation that should by rights be a bloody, chaotic struggle becomes. Croft's hands something closer to a demonstration of pure technical mastery. But William has also begun to notice things that trouble him, small observations that do not fit comfortably into the framework of his training. He has noticed that patients who survive the operation itself, who come through the shock and the blood loss without complication, still die afterward at a rate that seems to William's careful and increasingly anxious eye disturbingly high. He has begun, in the privacy of his own notebook, to wonder whether speed is really the virtue his teachers claim it to be, or whether it might be concealing something else entirely. He finishes his tea. The bell rings, marking the hour. It is time to go to the theatre. Before we follow William into the operating room, there is something worth understanding about the economics of surgery in 1870, because the money moving through this profession shaped almost everything happening inside it, including the very habits that were killing so many patients. For most of the century, surgery occupied an uncomfortable social position, somewhere below the more prestigious branch of medicine known as physic. A physician who diagnosed illness and prescribed remedies without touching the patient's body in any invasive way was considered a gentleman, educated at Oxford or Cambridge, entitled to be addressed as doctor. A surgeon, by contrast, worked with his hands, and in the eyes of Victorian society, working with one's hands placed a man closer to a tradesman than a gentleman, regardless of the skill involved. This distinction had ancient roots, stretching back to a time when surgery and barbering were literally the same profession, performed by the same practitioners with the same blades. Surgeons in England were addressed as Mr., not Doctor, a linguistic holdover from this history that persists, remarkably, into the present day. And in 1870, the distinction still carried real social weight. This mattered enormously to the surgeons themselves, and it shaped their behavior in ways that a modern observer might find surprising. Surgical income, for most of the century, had been modest. Before 1848, no major London hospital paid its surgeons a salary at all. Surgeons worked at teaching hospitals essentially for free, treating the poor without payment because the position brought prestige, and prestige could be converted into a private practice among wealthy patients who paid handsomely for treatment in their own homes. The entire economic structure of the profession depended on reputation, and reputation in an era before anesthesia was built substantially on speed. Think about what this meant in practical terms. A surgeon operating on a fully conscious patient, a patient who was screaming, thrashing, fighting to escape the pain, needed to work as quickly as humanly possible, both for the patient's sake and for the sake of his own professional standing. A slow surgeon was a cruel surgeon in the eyes of Victorian medical culture, regardless of how careful or precise his slowness might have been. Speed was not merely a technical skill. It was a moral virtue, publicly performed in front of an audience of students who would go on to spread the surgeon's reputation throughout the profession. This is the culture that produced men like Robert Liston, whose legend Frederick invoked so admiringly over breakfast this morning. Liston, who died more than 2 decades before the events of this story, remains the defining figure of the era's obsession with speed. He was capable of removing a leg above the knee in well under a minute, with his fastest recorded amputation reportedly completed in 28 seconds from first incision to final suture. He would enter the operating theater, address the assembled students with genuine theatrical flair, and announce, "Now, gentlemen, time me," before beginning his work with the confidence of a man who understood that he was performing as much as he was healing. Liston's speed saved lives, in the specific sense that matters most in a pre-anesthetic era. Faster surgery meant less time in shock, less blood loss, less agony for a fully conscious patient. His own recorded results were remarkably excellent by the standards of his time, with roughly 1 in 10 of his patients dying, compared to a broader average closer to 1 in 4. But his legend also captures something darker about the culture that celebrated him, because speed pursued as an end in itself, performed for an audience, carries its own risks. Liston is remembered, alongside his triumphs, for at least one catastrophic episode in which his haste led him to accidentally amputate an assistant's fingers along with a patient's leg during the same procedure, an incident so severe that both the assistant and the original patient later died of infection, along with a bystander who reportedly died of shock after being struck by the surgeon's blade. Medical historians still refer to it, with a certain dark humor, as the only operation in recorded history with a mortality rate of 300%. By 1870, anesthesia has removed the most urgent justification. A patient under chloroform does not need to be operated on in under a minute to spare them conscious agony. And yet, the culture of speed has not disappeared. It has, if anything, become more deeply embedded in the profession's sense of its own identity. Mr. Croft and surgeons like him throughout London continue to prize rapid, decisive operating as the mark of true surgical mastery, partly out of genuine habit, partly because the students in the gallery expect and reward it, and partly because no one has yet given them a compelling reason to slow down. The old justification for speed, sparing the patient conscious suffering, has quietly been replaced by a new and much more dangerous one. The less time a wound is open, surgeons reason, the less time it has to become contaminated by the impure air of the operating theater. They believe, in other words, that speed is still protecting their patients from infection. They are simply wrong about the mechanism. This economic structure created a curious and, in retrospect, deeply consequential divide in the quality of care available to different classes of Victorian patients, though not in the direction a modern observer might initially assume. James Doggett, Thomas Perrin, and every other patient William tended today are here precisely because they are poor, unable to afford private treatment in their own homes, and this poverty places them, paradoxically, in the hands of the most technically accomplished surgeons in London, men like Mr. Croft, who built their reputations and their private practices on the visible, demonstrable skill they perform daily in front of galleries of students. A wealthy patient undergoing the same amputation in the comfort of a private bedroom might receive the surgeon's individual attention and a quieter, calmer environment, but would very likely be operated on with the same unwashed hands, the same uncleaned instruments carried from the surgeon's hospital rounds. In this narrow and bitter sense, wealth offered no meaningful protection against the invisible danger that neither doctor nor patient, rich or poor, yet understood. The infection that killed a duke's amputated leg and the infection that killed a dock laborer's amputated leg traveled by exactly the same mechanism, carried on exactly the same kind of hands, regardless of how many silk sheets or serving staff surrounded the deathbed in question. There is also a financial dimension to the theatre itself that is worth understanding. By 1870, the operating theatre has become something more than a teaching space. It has become, in the more prestigious hospitals, something closer to a form of public entertainment. And this is not an exaggeration or a modern editorial flourish. Tickets to observe notable surgeons at work are, in some institutions, sold for a small fee. Wealthier and more fashionable hospitals have begun renovating their theatres specifically to accommodate larger and more socially prominent audiences, hoping that a reputation for dramatic, skillfully performed surgery will translate into prestige. And prestige, as always in this profession. Critics within the profession itself, a small minority of more cautious voices, have already begun warning that this drift towards spectacle is corrosive, that a surgeon performing for an audience is not the same as a surgeon focused solely on the welfare of the patient beneath his hands. But these warnings carry little practical weight against the accumulated momentum of decades of surgical culture and the simple, undeniable fact that a well-attended theatre brings a hospital exactly the kind of reputation it needs to attract paying patients, generous donors, and ambitious young students willing to pay for the privilege of training under a celebrated name. This economic reality shapes the entire atmosphere William will walk into this morning. The gallery is not simply full of medical students earnestly absorbed in their education. It is full of an audience, in the fullest theatrical sense of the word, drawn by reputation, spectacle, as much as by scientific interest. Croft, whatever his genuine medical skill, is performing for that audience every time he lifts a knife. For Mr. Croft, this meant something specific and consequential. His reputation, his income, his entire professional identity rested on being seen to work with speed and confidence. Slowing down to wash his hands between patients or to clean an instrument before its next use would not merely have struck him as unnecessary. It would have struck him, and everyone watching, as a kind of hesitation, an admission of doubt, precisely the quality that Victorian surgical culture had spent decades training its practitioners to eliminate. Let us return now to the theatre, where the morning's first patient is being brought in. His name is James Doggett. He is 28 years old, a bricklayer by trade, and 3 days ago a section of scaffolding gave way beneath him at a construction site near the river, crushing his left leg below the knee against a stone wall as he fell. The leg has not improved in the days since. It has, if anything, grown more alarming, the flesh discolored, the swelling pronounced. And this morning, Mr. Zas. Croft examined it briefly, exchanged a few quiet words with his senior colleagues, and made the decision that every surgeon in this hospital has made hundreds of times before. The leg must come off, and it must come off today, before whatever is happening inside that crushed limb spreads further into the rest of James Doggett's body. James is carried into the theatre on a canvas stretcher by 2 hospital porters, and the sight of him, pale and frightened, sends a ripple of anticipatory quiet through the gallery above. The benches are full this morning, packed with perhaps 100 students arranged in tiers around the central table, and William, standing at the table itself for the first time in his training, is acutely aware of their presence in a way he never was as a spectator himself. He can feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, and he understands, with a clarity that surprises him, exactly why surgeons like Mr. Croft come to crave this audience the way other men crave applause. James is lifted onto the wooden table at the center of the room. It is not padded. It resembles, more than anything, a sturdy carpenter's workbench, and the wood itself carries the permanent, ineradicable stains of everyone who has lain on it before him. Two assistants position James on his back, and William steps forward with the others to help hold him steady. Though this precaution, once the absolute center of every operation performed in this room, has become somewhat less essential since the arrival of anesthesia. Old habits persist regardless. The hands remain ready, even when they are no longer strictly needed. Mr. Croft enters the theater with the unhurried confidence of a man who has done this 1,000 times. He is perhaps 50 years old, solidly built, with the kind of physical presence that commands a room without any evident effort. He is wearing his operating coat, and this is the detail that William, despite 3 years of familiarity with the site, still finds himself noting with a small, private unease that he has never quite managed to suppress. The coat was, at some point in the distant past, likely black. It is now a deep mottled brown, stiff enough in places that it holds its shape almost independently of Mr. Denpo's. Croft's body, the fabric encrusted with the dried blood and matter of what must be hundreds of previous operations. Mr. Croft has worn this same coat for years. He does not wash it, and he has said more than once, in a tone of genuine pride rather than embarrassment, that a surgeon's coat should tell the story of his career, that the accumulated evidence of his work is a mark of experience rather than a source of shame. Mr. Croft trained under some of the last surgeons of the pre-anesthetic era, men who learned their trade when speed was not merely a professional virtue, but an act of basic mercy toward a fully conscious, screaming patient. And this formative experience shaped him in ways that have never fully loosened their grip. More than 20 years into an age when the original justification for extreme haste has largely disappeared. He came up through the ranks of this same hospital, a student not unlike William, worked as a dresser himself, endured the same long hours and the same cold mornings, and rose, through a combination of real talent and the kind of sustained, unglamorous diligence that the profession rarely celebrates as visibly as it celebrates a dramatic 90-second amputation. He is not, by the private testimony of those who know him outside the theater, an unkind or careless man. He is, by most accounts, a devoted father to his own children, a generous host to his fellow surgeons, and a physician who sincerely believes, with the entire weight of his professional identity, that he is doing everything within his power to heal the patients placed in his care. This is precisely what makes him such an effective illustration of the deeper tragedy running beneath this entire story. He is not a villain. He's a skilled, sincere, hard-working man, operating at the absolute peak of what his profession's incomplete understanding allowed him to achieve. And that peak, however impressive it looked from the gallery, was quietly killing a significant portion. This is not a metaphor. The coat is, in the most literal sense available, a wearable repository of biological material from every patient Mr. Croft has ever operated on, and in a matter of minutes, some of that material will find its way, invisibly and unavoidably, into James Doggett's open wound. The chloroform is administered first. A junior assistant holds a small wire frame covered in folded cloth over James's nose and mouth, and drips the clear, sweet-smelling liquid onto the fabric from a small bottle, a few drops at a time. The smell reaches William even from where he stands, faintly sweet, almost pleasant, entirely disconnected from the violence about to occur. James breathes it in, his eyes wide with fear above the cloth, and within a minute or two his breathing slows, his body relaxes, and the fear drains visibly from his face, replaced by a strange emptiness that comes with complete unconsciousness. William has watched this transition perhaps 200 times now, and it still strikes him as one of the strangest things he has ever witnessed. The sight of a fully conscious, terrified human being becoming, in the space of 60 seconds, something closer to an object. Mr. Croft steps to the table. He does not wash his hands. There is a basin nearby, the same basin that will be used throughout the morning for every patient who follows James Doggett onto this table. But Mr. Miss Croft's hands, at this moment, carry the residue of the ward rounds he completed an hour earlier. The previous patient's dressing he examined before entering the theatre, and whatever remained on his skin from yesterday's final operation, none of which was washed away in the intervening hours. He selects his instruments from a tray that William has prepared, instruments that were used on the previous day's patients, and wiped, at most, with a dry cloth. The amputation knife has an ivory handle, beautifully carved, the kind of instrument that a Victorian surgeon might display with genuine pride, and the fine seam where the blade meets the handle holds, invisibly, the residue of every previous use, because ivory and bone, unlike smooth steel, have microscopic crevices that no amount of wiping can fully clear. It is worth pausing on these instruments for a moment, because they tell their own quiet story about the priorities of the profession that made them Mr. Croft's surgical set, kept in a fitted velvet case lined with dark fabric, represents a considerable personal investment, the tools of his trade selected and maintained with the same pride a fine craftsman might bring to his workshop. The handles are ivory, or occasionally polished wood, chosen for their weight and balance in the hand, and for the simple aesthetic pleasure of a beautiful object, exactly the qualities a Victorian gentleman would prize in any well-made tool, whether a hunting rifle or a walking stick. What none of these design choices accounted for, because no one designing surgical instruments in this era had reason to account for it, was the question of what happened to material that lodged itself in the microscopic grain of ivory or the fine joints where blade met handle. A steel instrument, smooth and non-porous, could at least in theory be wiped reasonably clean. Ivory, bone, and decoratively carved wood, no matter how beautiful, no matter how prized, function instead as a kind of permanent reservoir, absorbing and retaining organic material across years of use in a way that no dry cloth. We return to the table where the instruments, beautiful and quietly contaminated, are already at work. "Time me, gentlemen, Mr. Bash," Croft says, not with the theatrical flourish of Liston's legendary announcement, but with something quieter, more habitual, a small ritual phrase that has survived from an earlier generation of surgical culture into a moment where its original purpose has largely disappeared. A few students in the gallery produce pocket watches. William notices with a discomfort he cannot fully name that several of the men in the upper benches are smoking cigars, the smoke curling up toward the skylight, and that at least two others appear to be engaged in quiet conversation entirely unrelated to the operation about to begin, as though they were seated at a music hall waiting for the main act to start. Frederick, William's fellow student from breakfast, is seated in the front row of the gallery this morning, close enough to lean forward and rest his forearms on the railing, and William catches his eye briefly before the operation begins. Frederick offers a small, eager nod, the expression of a man anticipating genuine entertainment, rather than bracing himself for the sight of another human being's body opened by a blade. And William, standing at the table itself, rather than watching from above for the first time in his training, finds himself struck by how differently the same event reads from these two positions. From the gallery, an amputation is a performance, a display of mastery to be admired and discussed afterward over tea. From beside the table, close enough to feel the warmth of James Doggett's body and to smell the mixture of chloroform and blood that no amount of familiarity ever quite neutralizes, it is something else entirely, something that William does not yet have adequate words for. though the gap between those two experiences will stay with him for the rest of his career. Mr. Croft makes his first incision. The speed is extraordinary, and William, despite everything he has begun to suspect about the dangers hidden inside this ritual, cannot help but feel a surge of pure admiration at the sight of it. The blade moves through skin and muscle with a fluid, practiced economy of motion, no hesitation, no wasted movement, the kind of physical mastery that takes decades to develop and that no textbook can fully teach. Blood flows freely, and William, along with the other assistant at the table, works quickly to manage it, applying pressure where needed, handing Mr. Croft each instrument in the exact sequence the operation demands. The bone saw comes next, and the sound it makes, a short, harsh, rasping crunch as the teeth bite through James Doggett's femur, is a sound that every student in this room has heard before and that none of them, William suspects, will ever fully stop hearing in their memory, even decades from now, long after they have become surgeons themselves. The entire procedure, from the first incision to the final stitch closing the flap of skin over the stump, takes just under 90 seconds. There is a brief appreciative murmur from the gallery, the closest thing to applause that decorum permits in this setting. Mr. Croft steps back from the table, and William catches a glimpse of his expression, something between professional satisfaction and the quiet, contained pride of a craftsman who has just completed a piece of work to his own exacting standard. The severed leg is removed from the table by a porter. James Doggett, still unconscious, is carefully lifted and prepared for transport back to the ward. The fresh wound dressed with a simple cloth bandage, and within minutes the table is being readied for the next patient. Croft does not wash his hands. He does not clean the knife or the saw or the ivory-handled instruments that will be used on the next case, and the one after that, and the one after that, throughout the remainder of the morning. He wipes his hands briefly on a cloth that hangs from his belt for this purpose, more a gesture of habit than an act of hygiene, and William watches him reach for the silk sutures that hang, ready for the next procedure, from a buttonhole on his operating coat. The same coat that has just been in direct contact with James Doggett's blood and the interior of his wound. Some surgeons, William has noticed, prefer to hold their sutures in their teeth between stitches for convenience, keeping their hands free during the more delicate work of closing a wound. Croft favors the buttonhole method, but the practice amounts to the same thing in every way that matters. The thread that will hold a patient's wound closed has spent the morning absorbing whatever the surgeon's coat or his mouth happened to be carrying. William, his own hands, like the surgeon's, have not been washed since he arrived at the hospital before dawn. He has touched James Doggett's severed leg, the bloodied instruments, the cloth used to wipe the table. He will touch the next patient with the same hands, the one after that, moving through the morning's operations the way he moves through his ward rounds, entirely unaware that he is functioning with every well-intentioned gesture as an agent of transmission for something no one in this room can see. The morning continues. There is a mastectomy performed on Sarah Higgins, the woman William checked on during his early rounds, her wound reopened for a more thorough removal of tissue that the surgeons believe was not fully excised in an earlier procedure weeks before. There is the amputation of 2 fingers on the right hand of a printer named Alfred Nash, crushed in the rollers of a press the previous afternoon, an injury common enough among London's printing trade that the surgeons handle it with the brisk efficiency of men who have performed the exact same procedure. There is an operation to drain a large abscess that has been causing a young seamstress named Mary Coombs considerable pain for several weeks. The swelling finally grown severe enough that she sought treatment despite the fear that had kept her away from the hospital until the pain became unbearable. There is the removal of a tumor from an elderly man's jaw, a slower and more delicate procedure than the amputations that bookend the morning, requiring nearly 10 minutes of careful work rather than Mr. 10 minutes. Croft's usual practice speed, though even here, the same unwashed hands and the same borrowed instruments move from the previous patient's wound directly into this one. Each patient is brought in by the same pair of porters, laid on the same unwashed table, anesthetized with chloroform administered from the same small bottle, and operated on with the same instruments that have by now passed through the hands and wounds of every patient who came before. William notices, somewhere around the fourth operation of the morning, that the basin of water used to clean the table between patients has taken on a deep, rust-colored tinge, and that no one has suggested changing it. By the medical understanding available to every person in this room, the water's color is simply evidence of a busy, productive morning, nothing more troubling than the visible residue of good, honest surgical work. By the time the theatre empties for the midday meal, Mr. Pranis, Croft has performed 6 operations in just over 2 hours, a pace that will be recorded in the hospital's registers as a mark of considerable professional accomplishment, and that will, within a week or two, quietly contribute to a mortality rate among his patients that no one in the building has yet connected to anything he did wrong. William walks out of the theatre into the grey November light of the courtyard, and for a moment he simply stands there, breathing the cold air, feeling the deep exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from the sustained concentration of watching a human body opened and closed 6 times. He thinks of James Doggett, sleeping now in the surgical ward, his leg gone, his wound already, though William has no way of knowing this, beginning to receive the bacterial population that arrived on Mr. Dex. Croft's hands on the ivory-handled knife, on the borrowed sutures pulled from a blood-stiffened buttonhole. He does not know that James Doggett's odds of surviving the next 2 weeks are, by the honest mathematics of this hospital's own records, worse than a coin flip. Let us step back from William's morning and look closely at the medical theory that made this outcome not just possible, but in the minds of everyone involved, entirely unremarkable. Because understanding this theory is the key to understanding everything that happens in this hospital. The doctrine of laudable pus, which William absorbed without question during his training and applies with genuine confidence every time he redresses a wound, has a history stretching back nearly 2,000 years to the Greek physician Galen, whose theories dominated Western medicine for longer than almost any other body of thought in human history. Galen taught that wounds naturally pass through a stage of suppuration as part of the healing process, and this idea, transmitted through centuries of medical education with remarkably little challenge, hardened into something close to unquestionable fact. The theory made a certain intuitive sense, and this is worth understanding because it explains why intelligent, well-trained physicians could hold a belief that now strikes us as obviously and tragically wrong. A wound that produced thick, well-formed, creamy pus often did, in fact, belong to a patient who survived. A wound that instead produced no discharge at all, but that spread rapidly, turned the surrounding flesh grey and foul-smelling, and killed the patient within days, was obviously the more frightening presentation. Victorian surgeons, observing these 2 different patterns without any concept of bacteriology to explain what was actually happening beneath the surface, drew the conclusion that seemed most obvious from the evidence in front of them. The pus itself, they reasoned, must be a sign of the body's healthy response, evidence that the wound was doing the necessary work of healing. The absence of pus, by contrast, seemed to indicate that something had gone wrong. What they could not see, because the technology to see it would not exist for another decade or more, was that the thick, laudable pus was itself a sign of bacterial infection, specifically the kind caused by organisms that produce a strong immune response. And the terrifying, fast-spreading, pus-free infections that so frightened Victorian surgeons, the ones we now call necrotizing soft tissue infections, were caused by a different and more aggressive category of bacteria entirely. One that destroys tissue so rapidly that the body's immune system barely has time to mount the kind of response that produces visible pus at all. The presence of pus was never a sign of health. It was simply a sign of one type of infection rather than a more violent and lethal alternative. William and every surgeon he has ever studied under has spent years learning to read a set of symptoms correctly by every measure except the one that actually mattered. The condition that terrifies the entire hospital staff, the one William saw briefly this morning behind the canvas curtain at the far end of the surgical ward, is hospital gangrene, and it represents the doctrine of laudable pus taken to its most horrifying extreme. This is not the same as the more familiar gangrene caused by loss of blood supply to a limb. Hospital gangrene, sometimes called phagedena in the medical literature of the period, is a rapidly spreading destruction of soft tissue that can appear in a wound that looked, only a day or two earlier, to be healing normally. The flesh at the wound's edges turns grey, then black. The smell, once it develops, is unlike anything else encountered in ordinary medical practice, and it is this smell, more than any other single feature, that the hospital staff have learned to fear, because by the time it becomes noticeable, the infection has usually already progressed beyond any hope of treatment. The mortality rate associated with hospital gangrene is staggering by any standard, historical or modern. In hospitals across Europe and America during this period, patients who developed the condition faced a genuine likelihood of death, and even patients who survived often did so only after the affected limb or tissue had been amputated again, sometimes repeatedly, in a desperate attempt to stay ahead of the spreading infection. The condition tends to appear in clusters, spreading through a ward in a pattern that Victorian physicians found deeply mysterious, sometimes affecting multiple patients in the same room within days of each other, a pattern we now understand perfectly as the signature of a contagious organism moving from patient to patient on unwashed hands, shared instruments, and reused dressings, but which Victorian medicine, committed to the theory of miasma, or bad air, could only explain by blaming the ventilation of the ward itself. This is why the windows are opened every day at midday, a ritual William has performed himself more times than he could count, without ever once questioning its underlying logic until recently. At noon, regardless of the weather, the ward nurses move down the length of the surgical ward, throwing open every window they can reach, and for perhaps 20 minutes the room fills with the raw, damp cold of a London winter. Patients pulling their blankets tighter, the flames in the ward's small fireplaces guttering in the sudden draft, while the staff stand by with the calm satisfaction of people performing a beneficial medical intervention. This is why hospital administrators discuss, with genuine seriousness, the ideal cubic footage of air that should surround each patient bed, figure that some medical authorities have specified with remarkable precision, insisting that a patient recovering from surgery requires at minimum several hundred cubic feet of fresh air circulation to avoid the miasmatic buildup believed to cause infection. The theory is elaborate, internally consistent, and almost entirely wrong. And the tragedy is that its wrongness is not a matter of laziness or stupidity on the part of the physicians who hold it. It is a matter of missing a single piece of information, the existence of microorganisms too small to see with the naked eye, without which an enormous amount of otherwise careful and rigorous observation leads to precisely the wrong conclusion. Consider what this means for the actual numbers involved. In some of the major hospitals of Europe during this period, patients undergoing a major amputation, exactly the kind of procedure William watched Mr. and Croft perform this morning, faced a mortality rate from post-operative infection alone that exceeded 50% in the worst affected institutions. This figure is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means that for a significant portion of Victorian surgical patients, the operation itself, however skillfully performed, was substantially less dangerous than what happened afterward in the ward in the days and weeks following surgery. As an infection that no one in the building could see or understand took hold and spread through tissue that had, only hours earlier, been successfully and expertly repaired. There is a term that some Victorian physicians had already begun using for this phenomenon, even without understanding its cause. And the term itself reveals how close observation could come to the truth while still missing the essential mechanism behind it. They called it hospitalism, general and somewhat mysterious tendency for patients treated in large, crowded hospitals to fare worse than patients treated in smaller institutions or in private homes, regardless of the skill of the surgeon involved. Some physicians noted, correctly, that mortality rates seemed to rise in proportion to how crowded and how long established a hospital's wards were, and attributed this, within the framework available to them, to some cumulative buildup of miasma in the walls and floors and air of an old building. Kind of invisible poison that older hospitals were believed to have absorbed over decades of housing the sick and dying. Some surgeons went so far as to recommend that hospitals be periodically abandoned and rebuilt on fresh ground, as though the structure itself carried a kind of contagious memory of disease. The observation that older, more crowded institutions produced worse outcomes was accurate. The explanation offered for it, involving haunted walls rather than accumulated bacterial contamination, passed continuously from patient to patient by the hands and instruments of the staff, was almost entirely wrong, though it would take Leicester's work and the researchers who followed him to finally identify why crowded wards proved so lethal, and to demonstrate that the solution lay not in abandoning old buildings, but in changing what happened inside them. For a patient like James Doggett, this means the successful amputation he underwent this morning, the 90-second procedure that Mr. Croft performed with such evident skill and that so impressed the gallery of watching students, was in some meaningful sense only the first half of the danger he now faces. The second half, the far more statistically likely cause of his eventual death, if he is unlucky, has already been set in motion, delivered directly into his open wound by the very instruments and hands that saved him from bleeding to death on the operating table. This is the paradox sitting at the heart of Victorian surgery in 1870, and it is worth naming clearly, because it explains everything else in this story. The surgeons of this era possessed genuine, hard-won anatomical brilliance. Croft's 92nd amputation was not luck or bravado. It represented years of study, thousands of hours of practice, and intimate command of human anatomy that a modern surgeon, working with the benefit of imaging technology and a full surgical team, might well envy in its raw, unassisted skill. And that same brilliant, skilled, well-intentioned surgeon was at every moment the single greatest threat to his own patient's survival, carrying invisible death on his hands and his instruments and his coat from one operation to the next, utterly convinced that he was doing everything correctly because by the medical standards of his training, he was. Let us return to William, because the afternoon holds a deep dive of its own, and the day is not yet finished. The theatre empties for the midday meal, and William's afternoon takes on a very different character from the drama of the morning's operations. He attends a lecture on the theory of inflammation delivered by one of the hospital's senior physicians in a cold lecture hall where perhaps 60 students take notes by the grey light filtering through tall windows, and the lecture reinforces, point by careful point, exactly the framework William has been taught since his first year of training. That inflammation and suppuration represent the body's natural, necessary response to injury, that the physician's task is to support this process rather than interfere with it, and that excessive cleanliness, ironically, sometimes discussed by more conservative voices in the profession as a potential irritant to a wound rather than a protection for it. William takes careful notes, as he always does, and says nothing of the doubts that have been accumulating in him for months. After the lecture, he spends nearly 2 hours in the hospital's dispensary, assisting the apothecary in the preparation of the day's medicines, a task that occupies a significant portion of every dresser's training, and that involves considerably less drama than the operating theatre. He measures out laudanum for patients in severe pain, prepares poultices from linseed and other traditional remedies believed to draw out infection, and mixes the various tonics and cordials that the hospital's physicians prescribe with a confidence that William has increasingly come to recognize as exceeding the actual evidence for their effectiveness. The dispensary smells of herbs and alcohol and the sharp, medicinal tang of chemicals William can name but does not fully understand the properties of, and the work is methodical enough that his mind wanders, more than once this afternoon, back to the ward and to Edward's graying wound, and to a question he cannot quite silence about whether any of the remedies he is carefully measuring out this afternoon will make the slightest difference to a boy whose infection William increasingly suspects has nothing to do with bad air or an imbalance of the body's humors, and everything to do with something that arrived in his wound from a source no one in this building has yet learned to suspect. By 4 o'clock, the light outside has already begun to fail, the way it does through the short grey days of a London November, and the gas lamps in the wards are lit early to compensate. William's afternoon has been spent partly in lectures, partly in the dispensary, assisting with the preparation of medicines, and now, as evening settles over the hospital, he makes his second round of the surgical ward before the day is finished. James Doggett is awake when William reaches his bed, groggy from the lingering effects of the chloroform, his face pale but his manner calm. He asks, in the flat, careful voice of a man still processing what has happened to him, whether the leg is truly gone, and William confirms that it is, offering what comfort he can, which mostly takes the form of honest, practical reassurance about the skill of the surgeon. William believes what he is telling James. He has no reason not to. The wound looks, by every standard he has been trained to apply, entirely normal for this stage of recovery. Thomas Perrin, 3 beds down, is less well than he was this morning. William notices it immediately, the flush along the cheekbones, the slight quickness of the breath, and he takes Perrin's pulse with a growing unease that he tries, without much success, to talk himself out of. A fever has begun. It is mild, still within what William's training tells him is an acceptable range of the body's natural response to a healing wound. But William has seen this pattern before, has watched it in other patients on other evenings, and he knows, in the part of his mind that has started to trust its own observations over the confident assurances, that a mild fever this evening sometimes becomes a serious fever within 2 days, and a serious fever sometimes becomes something from which a patient does not return. Perrin, despite the fever, is in good spirits tonight. He asks William, as he has asked every evening this week, whether there is any word on when he might be fit to go home to his wife and children. William tells him the truth, as much of it as seems useful to share, that the wound is healing as expected, and that a few more days of rest should tell them more. Perrin nods, satisfied with this answer, and tells William a small story about his eldest boy, who has apparently taken to walking around the family's rooms, imitating his father's limp piece of childish mimicry that Perrin recounts with genuine affection, rather than any bitterness. And William finds himself smiling despite the fever readings recorded in his casebook only moments before, because this is also part of the work, holding two contradictory truths in his mind at once: the clinical concern and the simple human warmth of a father missing his children. He records Perrin's temperature and pulse in his casebook and moves on, because there is nothing else to do. No medicine in the hospital's dispensary can address an infection that no one yet believes exists. The remedies available to William are the remedies of an entire medical tradition built around symptoms rather than causes: cooling, compresses for the fever, rest, nourishing broth when the patient can tolerate it, prayers in the quieter, more private moments from the nursing sisters who tend these wards, with a devotion that has nothing to do with medical theory and everything to do with simple human compassion for suffering they cannot otherwise relieve. Edward, the 12-year-old boy in the 14th bed, is worse, considerably worse. The fever, William noted with concern this morning, has climbed through the day, and the boy's mother, who has been permitted to sit with him for a few hours this evening under the hospital's limited visiting arrangements, holds his hand with an expression that William finds almost unbearable to look at directly. He checks the boy's wound, and what he sees there confirms the fear that has been building in him since this morning. The edges of the incision have taken on a greyish cast that William has learned, through hard and repeated experience, to associate with the earliest stages of the condition that terrifies this entire hospital. He does not say this aloud, not to the mother, not even fully to himself. He simply notes it in his casebook, in the careful clinical language his training has taught him to use, and moves to the next bed, because there are 20 more patients to see before the ward falls quiet for the night, and a dresser does not have the luxury of stopping to grieve in advance for a patient who has not yet died. Edward's leg was taken 8 days ago, after a factory accident that William has heard described in fragments: a machine belt, an unguarded gear, the kind of injury that happens to children with a regularity that the hospital staff have learned to absorb without much visible reaction. Because factories across London employ children of Edward's age in numbers that would shock a later century, and the accidents that follow are simply an accepted cost of that arrangement. Edward's mother works as a washerwoman, and William gathers from small comments she has made over the past week that the loss of her son's ability to work will mean real hardship for the family, on top of the grief she is now visibly bracing herself against. She asks William tonight, in a voice pitched carefully low so as not to wake her son, whether the fever is a normal part of healing. William tells her because it is, in a narrow sense, technically true within the framework of his training, that fevers of this kind are not unusual after surgery, and that the hospital's physicians are monitoring him closely. He does not tell her what the greyish tissue at the wound's edge actually means, partly because he is not yet certain enough to say it with authority, and partly because he cannot bring himself to take away the small, fragile comfort she is holding onto in a room that offers her almost nothing else. This is the part of William's day that never appears in the theatrical drama of the operating room, and it is, in its quiet, unglamorous way, the truest measure of what Victorian medicine actually is in 1870. Not the 90-second amputation, however impressive the technical skill involved. This: the long walk down a row of iron beds, checking pulses and temperatures, watching for the early signs of infections that no one can prevent and few can successfully treat, carrying the knowledge, unspoken but increasingly undeniable to a thoughtful young man like William. Well-intentioned practices are quietly killing a significant portion of the patients it is trying to save. William finishes his rounds a little after 7 in the evening. He eats a simple supper in the students' common room, and several of his fellow students are eager to discuss the day's operations, especially Mr. Croft's morning performance which has already acquired something of a legendary quality in the retelling, the 90-second amputation growing, in the space of a single afternoon, into an even more impressive feat than it actually was. William listens without contributing much. He is thinking about Thomas Perrin's flushed cheeks and Edward's graying wound edges, and the strange, uncomfortable gap that has opened over the past several months between what he has been taught to believe about the causes of infection. He returns to his lodgings a little before 9, exhausted in the specific way that comes from a 16-hour day spent almost entirely on his feet, and before he allows himself to sleep, he takes out his notebook and writes, by candlelight, short entry recording the day's events. James Doggett's amputation. The speed of Mr. Croft's work. The condition of Perrin and Edward, noted with the careful, understated language of a young man who is beginning to suspect something that he does not yet have the vocabulary or the authority to say plainly, not even to himself. He writes one additional line before he closes the notebook, a line that he will return to many years later, long after he has qualified as a surgeon in his own right, long after the medical world has been transformed by discoveries that tonight remain entirely unknown to him. He writes, I cannot help but wonder whether the wound heals in spite of what we do to it, rather than because of it. He does not know how right he is. He has no way, November of 1870, of knowing that a Scottish surgeon working many miles north, in Glasgow, has already begun to prove exactly this, and that within a few short years, the entire foundation of William's medical training will be shown to have been built on a mistaken understanding of the invisible world that lives on unwashed hands. We step back now, because the story of that Scottish surgeon, and the strange, difficult, decades-long fight to make the medical establishment believe him, deserves to be told in full. His name is Joseph Lister, and in November of 1870, while William is making his evening rounds in London, Lister is working at the University of Glasgow, pursuing an idea that the majority of his professional colleagues regard as, at best, an interesting curiosity, and at worst, an active insult to the dignity of their profession. Lister's journey to this position began several years earlier, when he encountered the work of the French chemist Louis Pasteur, whose research into fermentation had produced a striking and, to most of the scientific establishment, deeply counterintuitive conclusion. Pasteur had demonstrated, through careful experimentation, that the process of fermentation and putrefaction was not a spontaneous chemical event, as had long been assumed, but was instead caused by living microorganisms. Lister, reading Pasteur's work with the attentive curiosity of a man already troubled by the high rates of infection he observed in his own surgical wards, made an intellectual leap that few of his contemporaries were prepared to follow him across. If microorganisms could cause milk to sour and wine to spoil, he reasoned, might similar organisms be responsible for the suppuration and gangrene that killed so many of his patients, rather than the vague, unfalsifiable miasma? In 1865, Lister began experimenting with a chemical called carbolic acid, a substance that had recently come into use as a treatment for the foul-smelling sewage in the town of Carlisle, on the theory that it might neutralize whatever was causing the odor. Lister wondered whether the same substance might neutralize whatever was causing infection in an open wound. He began applying carbolic acid directly to the wounds of patients with compound fractures, injuries in which the broken bone pierces the skin and creates a direct pathway for infection, historically among the most dangerous injuries a Victorian surgeon could treat, carrying amputation rates that approach certainty in some hospitals. Lister's early results, published in a series of articles in The Lancet beginning in the spring of 1867, were striking. Patients treated with his carbolic acid method were surviving compound fractures that would previously have required amputation or resulted in fatal infection. He documented case after case in careful methodical detail, building an evidentiary record that to a modern reader familiar with the eventual triumph of germ theory looks almost self-evidently persuasive. It was not received that way at the time. The resistance Lister encountered came from multiple directions at once, and understanding this resistance requires setting aside, for a moment, the comfortable assumption that scientific truth simply announces itself and is naturally accepted by reasonable people once demonstrated. The surgical establishment of 1870 has spent an entire career, in many cases decades, operating according to the principles of miasma theory and the doctrine of laudable pus. These are not merely abstract ideas to men like Mr. Croft. They are the foundation of an entire professional identity, built through years of training, reinforced by every teacher these surgeons ever studied under, and validated, or so it seemed, by countless personal observations over the course of long careers. Lister was asking these men to accept that their own hands, the very instruments of their healing skill, had been quietly killing their patients for their entire working lives. He was asking them to accept that the accumulated stains on a beloved operating coat, worn with genuine professional pride, represented not experience, but active danger. This is an enormously difficult thing to ask any person to accept about themselves, regardless of the quality of the evidence presented. And Victorian surgeons, proud men in a profession that had only recently begun to claim genuine social respectability, were not eager to accept it. There was also a more straightforward scientific objection, one that deserved to be taken seriously on its own terms, rather than dismissed as mere stubbornness. Germ theory itself, in 1870, remains deeply controversial within the broader scientific community, not merely within surgery. Pasteur's work was significant, but it had not yet been extended into a fully developed, universally accepted framework explaining disease transmission in the way that later researchers, building on both Pasteur's and Lister's foundational work, would eventually establish. Many serious, intelligent physicians looked at Lister's results and offered alternative explanations that, given the incomplete state of scientific understanding at the time, were not entirely unreasonable. Perhaps the carbolic acid worked through some other chemical mechanism unrelated to germs at all. Perhaps Lister's patients simply happened to be healthier or younger, or luckier, than the patients treated by other methods. Perhaps the results would not hold up under wider testing. Science practiced honestly requires exactly this kind of skepticism, and some portion of the resistance Lister faced came from physicians applying that skepticism in good faith, even if, in this case, they turned out to be wrong. Lister's response to this resistance was to refine his methods and expand his evidence, developing over the following years an increasingly comprehensive antiseptic system. He introduced a device that has become perhaps the most visually striking symbol of his work, a spraying apparatus that filled the air of the operating theater with a continuous fine mist of diluted carbolic acid throughout the entire duration of an operation. The device, sometimes called by the somewhat undignified nickname of the donkey engine, required an assistant to work a hand pump continuously, generating a pale yellow cloud that settled over the surgeon, the patient, the wound, and everything in the immediate vicinity of the operating table. The theory was elegant in its logic, even if the execution proved imperfect. If germs traveled through the air, as Lister increasingly believed, then saturating that air with a substance capable of killing them should protect the wound from infection, regardless of what else might be happening in a crowded, poorly ventilated. The spray was, by every account from the surgeons and assistants who worked beneath it, deeply unpleasant to endure. Carbolic acid is a caustic substance, and prolonged exposure to its vapor caused real physical harm to the medical staff who worked in its presence day after day, irritating the eyes, burning the delicate skin of the hands, and in some documented cases causing more serious respiratory damage to surgeons who spent years operating inside that yellow mist. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it complicates any simple narrative of Lister as an unambiguous hero arriving to rescue Victorian medicine from its own ignorance. The treatment that would eventually save countless patients came at a real and painful cost to the very practitioners who adopted it, a brutal, imperfect stepping stone toward the sterile, carefully controlled operating rooms of the following century, rather than a clean, immediate solution that everyone could simply embrace without sacrifice. The adoption of Lister's methods, where it happened at all in 1870, proceeded unevenly and slowly. Some surgeons, especially younger men, more open to new ideas and less invested in defending the practices of their own earlier training, began incorporating carbolic acid treatment into their work and reported results that echoed Lister's own findings: sharp reductions in postoperative infection and mortality among their patients. Other surgeons, including some of considerable seniority and reputation, dismissed the entire system as an overcomplicated fuss, a fashionable theory pursued by a man whose personality struck some contemporaries as excessively earnest and whose methods struck them as needlessly elaborate for problems that traditional practice had always managed well enough. At a meeting of the British Medical Association in the years surrounding this story, one senior surgeon delivered what was described as a forceful public attack on the entire premise of antiseptic surgery, rejecting germ theory outright and dismissing Lister's results as unreliable or coincidental. Mr. Croft, the surgeon William assisted this very morning, falls into the second category. He has heard of Lister's work in the vague, second-hand way that news travels through the medical profession via journals and conversation at professional gatherings, and he regards it, when he thinks of it at all, with the mild, dismissive skepticism of a man who has performed thousands of successful operations by his own standards, and sees no compelling reason to complicate a method that has served him and his patients, in his own estimation, perfectly well for over 2 decades. He does not know, and has no way of knowing on this November evening, that within the coming years, the accumulated weight of evidence from surgeons who did adopt Lister's methods will become impossible for even the most skeptical members of the profession to continue ignoring. He does not know that the practices he takes such professional pride in, the unwashed coat, the reused instruments, the borrowed sutures pulled from a blood-stiffened buttonhole, will eventually be recognized within his own lifetime as directly responsible for a substantial portion of the deaths he has, until now, attributed to fate, to the patient's own constitution, or to the simple, unavoidable risks of surgery itself. The transition to modern, sterile surgical practice will not arrive as a single dramatic breakthrough. It will arrive slowly, unevenly, contested at every step by proud and truly skilled men who found it almost unbearable to accept that their own hands had been the instrument of so much unnecessary death. It will take the accumulation of statistics from hospital after hospital, the gradual retirement of an older generation of surgeons trained under the doctrine of laudable pus, and the eventual decisive confirmation of germ theory by researchers building on both Pasteur's and Lister's foundational work, before the practices William witnessed this morning are finally recognized, universally and without serious dispute, as a form of medically sanctioned harm. It is worth understanding something of the man at the center of this fight, because Lister himself does not resemble the confident, crusading reformer that later generations sometimes imagine when they picture the founder of antiseptic surgery. By most contemporary accounts, he was a quiet, methodical, somewhat reserved man, more comfortable in the laboratory than in public argument, a devout Quaker whose religious convictions shaped both his gentleness with patients and his stubborn, unhurried patience. He did not relish conflict with his colleagues. He simply continued, year after year, publishing his results, refining his methods, and responding to criticism with more data rather than louder rhetoric, a strategy that proved in the end far more durable than the passionate advocacy of a more combative reformer might have been. Where Robert Liston commanded a room with theatrical bravado, Lister persuaded one slowly, through the accumulated weight of careful observation, and the two styles could not have been more different, even though both men are remembered today as giants of the same surgical tradition. The cost of that patience fell, in no small part, on Lister himself and on the assistants who worked alongside him through years of refining an imperfect system. Carbolic spray that would come to define the popular image of Listerism was, by his own later admission, one of the less essential elements of his method, more a visible symbol of antisepsis than its actual mechanism of protection, and yet it was the element that drew the most attention, the most mockery, and the most physical suffering from the surgeons and nurses who stood inside its yellow mist for hours at a time. There is something almost tragic in this detail, that the aspect of Lister's system most responsible for winning public and professional attention was also among the most punishing to use, and in later years, among the first elements he himself would abandon. As his understanding deepened, his methods evolved toward the more targeted, less indiscriminate antisepsis that would eventually give way to true asepsis, the sterile, germ-free environment of the modern operating room. None of this refinement has happened yet on this particular November evening in 1870. Lister is still years away from the full vindication his work will eventually receive, still fighting case by case, hospital by hospital, to convince a profession that has built its entire sense of professional identity around a theory that is quietly, catastrophically wrong. He does not know, any more than William does, exactly how long this fight will take, or how many more patients, like James Doggett and Thomas Perrin and Ellen Grady, will die in the meantime in hospitals across Britain and Europe from infections that a simple change in surgical habit could have prevented. Let us return one final time to William, because the day is nearly finished, and there is a quiet reckoning still to come. But before we do, let us step back and look at the whole shape of this day, because there are patterns here that deserve to be named clearly, patterns that reach far beyond one hospital, one surgeon, one anxious young dresser writing in his notebook by candlelight. The first pattern is the illusion of progress, and it is worth naming first because it is the one most likely to be misunderstood. Anesthesia was, without question, one of the great humanitarian achievements of the 19th century, sparing millions of patients the specific, immediate agony of fully conscious surgery. But the story of 1870 shows us something uncomfortable about how progress actually works, which is that a genuine advance in one domain can create dangerous new problems in another, especially when the people benefiting from that advance do not fully understand why it works or what it has changed. Anesthesia did not simply make surgery painless. It removed the primary check on surgical ambition, the patient's own physical struggle, and the surgeon's own urgency to finish quickly. And in doing so, it allowed surgeons to attempt longer, more invasive, more ambitious operations than they ever could have performed on a conscious, thrashing patient. More operations were attempted, more wounds were opened, and into every one of those wounds went the same unwashed hands, the same uncleaned instruments, the same confident ignorance that had governed surgical practice for centuries. The mortality rate from surgery itself may well have declined. The mortality rate from what happened afterward, many hospitals, appears to have risen. Progress, in other words, is not a single arrow pointing steadily upward. It is possible to solve one problem so effectively that you create the conditions for an entirely new one and not notice you have done so for years. There is a broader version of this pattern that reaches well beyond Victorian surgery, worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. Any time a society removes one obstacle to a dangerous activity, whether that activity is surgery or exploration or the handling of powerful new technology, there is a risk that the removal of the obvious danger simply clears space for a less obvious one to expand into. The Victorian surgeon, who no longer needed to fear a screaming, struggling patient, did not become more cautious with his newfound freedom. He became bolder, precisely because the immediate, visible check on his behavior had been removed, and the invisible check, the one that would eventually arrive in the form of antiseptic technique, had not yet been discovered to take its place. This is not a uniquely Victorian failure. It is a pattern that recurs in different forms throughout the history of human ingenuity, and it is part of what makes the story of William's single ordinary day feel, despite the strangeness of its specific details, quietly familiar. The second pattern is the terrible cost of an incomplete theory, honestly applied. It would be easy, looking back from a position of modern knowledge, to imagine that Victorian surgeons were simply careless or lazy or willfully ignorant, choosing not to wash their hands out of some combination of arrogance and indifference. The truth is more unsettling than that. William Hartley is not careless. He is thoughtful, diligent, and increasingly troubled by observations that do not fit the framework he has been taught. De Croft is not lazy. He has devoted decades to mastering a genuinely difficult physical skill, and he applies that skill with real dedication to the patients under his care. Both men are operating in complete good faith, according to the best available medical theory of their time, and both men are, through no failure of character or intelligence, actively contributing to the deaths of the people they are trying to save. This is what makes the story of Victorian medicine so much more disquieting than a simple tale of villainy. It suggests that good intentions and careful, honest effort are not by themselves sufficient protection against catastrophic error if the underlying framework of understanding contains a single, invisible, unexamined flaw. We are rarely as protected by our own good intentions as we would like to believe, and the operating theatre of 1870 stands as one of history's clearest demonstrations of exactly how far that protection can fail to reach. The third pattern is the specific danger of confidence without complete information. Mr. Croft's speed, his skill, his professional pride, all of these qualities are genuinely admirable in isolation. But they became dangerous precisely because they were paired with an absolute unquestioned certainty about the causes of infection. A certainty that left no room for the kind of doubt that might have prompted him to wash his hands, or clean his instruments, or wonder whether his own confident practices might be part of the problem he was fighting. There is a version of this pattern that appears again and again throughout the history of science and medicine, and indeed throughout most fields of human expertise. The most dangerous errors are rarely made by people who know they might be wrong. They are made by people who are certain they are right, and whose confidence has been reinforced over years of practice by exactly the kind of evidence that a flawed theory reliably produces. Mr. Croft has performed thousands of operations. Some patients died, most survived. From inside his own framework of understanding, this looked like acceptable, unavoidable risk, the natural cost of a dangerous profession, rather than evidence of a preventable and systematic failure. The fourth pattern is the invisible labor and the invisible cost, and this one belongs to William. More than anyone else in this story, he is not the surgeon. He will not be remembered, if he is remembered at all beyond his own family, for any dramatic breakthrough or historic achievement. He is simply a young man doing careful, exhausting, unglamorous work. walking a ward at 7 in the evening, noting a patient's fever in a casebook, wondering privately whether the profession he has devoted years of his life and his family's limited resources to entering. This is the position that most people occupy in medicine and in every other field, most of the time. Not the surgeon performing the celebrated 90-second amputation in front of an admiring gallery, but the quiet, attentive observer who notices something is wrong, long before anyone with the authority to change the system. There is a particular loneliness in this position that deserves acknowledgement because it is easy, from the comfortable distance of hindsight, to imagine that William's private doubts must have felt validating a quiet foreknowledge of the truth that history would eventually confirm. In the moment, on this specific November evening, they feel like nothing of the kind. They feel like uncertainty, like the discomfort of noticing a pattern that contradicts everything one's teachers have said, without the standing, the evidence, or the vocabulary to prove that the pattern is real rather than coincidence. William cannot yet call what he suspects germ theory, because the term barely exists in the form we would recognize, and the small private note in his casebook, "The wound heals in spite of what we do to it," is not the triumphant insight of a man who has solved a mystery. It is the anxious observation of a man who senses that something is deeply wrong and has no one yet to share that suspicion with. The fifth pattern is the slowness of moral and scientific progress. Joseph Lister published his first findings in 1867. He would continue refining, defending, and advocating for his methods for years afterward, facing skepticism, outright hostility, and the simple, grinding inertia of an entrenched professional culture that did not want to believe what the evidence was telling it. The full acceptance of germ theory and the transformation of surgical practice that followed from it would take decades to complete. Not because the science was unclear, but because science alone has never been sufficient to change deeply held professional identities. Truth, even well-documented truth, has to fight its way past pride, past financial interest, past the simple human difficulty of admitting that the work of one's entire career been quietly causing harm. The sixth and final pattern is the particular cruelty of a threshold moment, a period of history that is neither one thing nor the other. If William had trained a generation earlier, before anesthesia existed, he would have operated within a system that was, in its own brutal way, more honest about its limitations. Everyone understood that surgery was a last, desperate resort, survivable only through speed and luck. If William trains a generation later, once antiseptic and eventually aseptic technique has become the unquestioned standard of the profession, he will operate within a system that has genuinely solved, or come close to solving, the problem that is quietly killing so many of today's patients. But William stands at neither of those points. He stands in the gap between them in a moment when one danger has been conquered and celebrated, while a second, greater danger remains completely unrecognized, hidden behind a confident and internally consistent theory that everyone in his profession has been trained to trust without question. There is a specific kind of tragedy reserved for people who live through transitional moments in history, watching problems solved and new problems created almost simultaneously, without the benefit of hindsight that would let them see clearly which of their era's confident certainties and which will be remembered as a kind of collective, well-intentioned blindness. Let us return to William one last time, because his day, like every day in this hospital, must eventually end. It is past 10 o'clock now, and the house where William lodges has gone quiet, his two fellow students already asleep in their own rooms down the hall. His candle has burned low, the flame guttering slightly in a draught that finds its way through the gap beneath his window, and he sits for a while longer at his small writing table, his notebook closed now. His hands finally still after a day that began with dressing changes in the cold grey hour before dawn and ended with the greying wound edges of a 12-year-old boy whose mother sat holding his hand as though her grip alone might keep him tethered to the world. William thinks about tomorrow because tomorrow will bring more of the same. More rounds, more dressings, changed with the same unwashed hands that changed today's dressings. Another operation, perhaps with Mr. Barr, Croft or one of the other senior surgeons, another patient carried into the theatre beneath the gallery of watching students. Another demonstration of the genuine, hard-earned anatomical skill that this profession has spent centuries developing, paired with the same profound and entirely invisible blindness to the danger that skill cannot address. He thinks of James Doggett, sleeping now with his leg gone and his wound already. Though William cannot know this with certainty, beginning the quiet work of healing or the quiet work of killing him, depending on what exactly arrived in that wound this morning. He thinks of Thomas Perrin's flushed cheeks and hopes, in the simple private way that a tired young man hopes for things he cannot control, that the fever breaks rather than climbs. He does not allow himself to think too long about Edward, because there is a kind of grief that a dresser learns, out of professional necessity, to hold at a careful distance, not because he does not feel it, but because feeling it too fully, too often, would make the work impossible to continue. He blows out his candle. The room falls into darkness, lit only faintly by the gas lamp burning in the street below his window, and William lies awake for a while longer than usual tonight, listening to the sounds of a London that never fully quiets, the distant rattle of a late cart on cobblestones, the muffled call of a night watchman somewhere several streets away. He thinks again of the line he wrote in his notebook: "The wound heals in spite of what we do to it, rather than because of it," and he wonders, on the edge of sleep, whether he will ever have the standing, the evidence, or simply the courage to say such a thing aloud to a man like Mr. Pan. Croft, whose confidence in his own methods has never once, in William's 3 years of observing him, shown the smallest crack of doubt. He does not know, as he finally drifts towards sleep, that the doubt he is carrying alone tonight, in a cold rented room, in a city of 3 million people, is the same doubt that a Scottish surgeon has already begun to prove correct with carbolic acid and careful statistics. He does not know that within William's own working lifetime, the operating theatre he stood in this morning, with its unwashed hands and its blood-stiffened coats and its crowded gallery of smoking, chattering students, will be replaced by something almost unrecognizable: a sterile, quiet, carefully controlled room where hands are scrubbed and instruments are boiled, and the invisible war that killed so many of today's patients is finally, if never completely, brought under control. He does not know either what will become of him specifically, though we can imagine it, if only because his own combination of careful observation and quiet unwillingness to accept comfortable explanations is exactly the temperament that history tends to reward. Eventually, if a person survives long enough to see the world catch up with what they already suspected, perhaps William qualifies in 2 years as planned and spends his early career as an unremarkable general practitioner in a provincial town not unlike the one he grew up in, applying what he learned in London. Nagging skepticism about certain of its methods that he keeps mostly to himself, until the wider profession gives him permission to say it aloud. Perhaps, when Lister's methods finally achieve the broad acceptance they are still years away from tonight, William becomes one of the earlier adopters among his generation of surgeons, remembering perhaps a specific November evening when a boy named Edward lay dying of an infection nobody could explain. And Thomas Perrin's fever rose through a night that no medicine available could address. We cannot know this for certain. William Hartley is, after all, a composite, drawn from the countless real dressers and students who moved through hospitals exactly like this one, during precisely this transitional decade, their individual names, mostly lost to history even as their collective experience, shaped the profession. Well-intentioned harm. What we can know, with more certainty than we can know anything about William's specific fate, is what happened to the wider world he inhabited. Within William's working lifetime, assuming he lives an ordinary span of years, he will watch germ theory move from a controversial minority position to the unquestioned foundation of all serious medical practice. He will watch the operating theatre itself change almost beyond recognition. The wooden benches and the smoking spectators, replaced by sterile rooms, controlled access, and a culture of hygiene so thorough that the practices of 1870, the unwashed hands, the shared basin, the coat worn as a badge of pride, will come to seem not merely outdated, but almost unimaginable. The kind of detail that a later generation of medical students will hear about in lectures and struggle to fully believe. For tonight, none of that has happened yet. For tonight, William Hartley is simply a tired young man in a cold room, carrying an uneasy suspicion he cannot yet prove, in a city where the fog will return again tomorrow morning, and the wards will fill again with new patients, and somewhere across town, in his own comfortable house. Edmund Croft sleeps soundly, his operating coat hanging ready for the morning, entirely at peace with a day's work he has every reason, by everything his profession has taught him, to consider a genuine success. Somewhere between these two sleeping men, the surgeon at rest in his certainty and the dresser at rest in his doubt, lies the whole uncomfortable truth of this particular moment in history. Neither of them is wrong to sleep. Neither of them could have done differently, given what they knew and did not know on this one ordinary Tuesday in November. And neither of them can see, from where they lie tonight, how close the answer already is, sitting in a laboratory in Glasgow, waiting for a profession proud enough to have built its entire identity around a mistake to finally, slowly, painfully let that mistake go. The house is quiet now. The fire has burned down to its last coals. Somewhere out in the fog, a bell tower marks the hour, the sound carrying faintly across rooftops that have seen this same fog roll in every November for as long as anyone can remember. Sleep well, friend. We have been somewhere real tonight.